And I think we can continue with our next presentation. We again have two presenters. We have Jana Osterkamp and we have Becker, both well-known authors in this field, and their presentation is titled A State and a Desk. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I think I just hand over to Jana to take it off.
Yeah, thanks from my side too for having us here. And we, for a couple of years, we are working together on a project called The Emperor's Death. And it's about the desk of Francis Joseph at his chancellor office. So as you might expect, we are now heading for the ideal of civil servants, at least in the beginning. So I think everybody agrees that the path to a modern constitutional state can be paved only with loyal civil servants. And even modern constitution lives only through a professional administration. In turn, the constitutional state creates a multitude of institutions, control bodies, and thus an increased need for civil servants in order to administer itself as a rule of law state. In a Habsburg monarchy, however, the path to a constitutional state was extraordinarily winding. The changes in the political constitution of this multi-ethnic empire, therefore, demanded a considerable commitment of the ideal civil servant. In the 19th century, the heart of an Austrian civil servant had to beat equally hotly for the neo-absolutist monarchy, the parliamentary monarchy, the dualism of Austria-Hungary, and the exceptional state of affairs in the First World War. So this is required by the code of professional ethics. For the ideal civil servant of the Habsburg monarchy should be completely devoted to the regent, the government, and the empire, not only with his external behavior and actions, but also with his inner feelings and convictions. And loyalty is one keyword of this behavior, and we are looking now at the next slide where we see civil servants in arms. So the ideal of unbreakable loyalty and fidelity of civil servants to the region and the government was ingrained in civil servant candidates at an early age in the Habsburg monarchy. It was inculcated in them with, for example, so-called guides for young aspiring civil servants, and during their law studies with the textbooks on state law. With the constitutional changes, however, the idea of the civil servant's loyalty also changed. In the 1850s, after the suppression of the 1848 revolution, the demand for loyalty on the part of civil servants was particularly high. It meant unconditionally suspending all one's own interests in favor of the empire. So in 1857, the mentioned guide for young civil servants stated that civil servants, I quote, will, through his honest performance of duty as an organ of government, regardless of his position on it, keep the heart of the monarch open to the people, and in return bring the heart of the subjects of the country to the regent, his throne, and the dynasty. End of quote. So the guideline demands unconditional loyalty to the monarch, but also to the imperial unity of the entire dynasty. So here the thrust is clear. It was necessary to stabilize the shattered land and, at the same time, to fill the new fields of activity that arose from the dissolution of patrimonial rights. 40 years later, and even before the enactment of the service pragmatics, the Dienstpragmatik, the ideal of the civil servant had changed. On the one hand, dualism had an impact. After 1867, a different type of civil servant emerged in the Hungarian crownlands and in Austria. In Hungary, the state administration began only above the comitates and counties, while the middle and lower administration continued to be in the hands of the Hungarian aristocratic elite, and only gradually did the principle of merit and guidelines for legal training became established. In Austria, the state-building process was much more closely linked to the formation of a staff of officials down to the district and county level. Parliamentarization and constitutionalization influenced the ideal of civil servants here, especially in comparison to the neo-absolutist era. In his 1891 textbook on state law, the sociologist Ludwig Gumplowicz notes the pluralization of the inner world of civil servants. I quote, "The law allows an exception to the principle of the civil servant's dependence when a civil servant is elected to the people's representation." End of quote. Because the electoral code then also allows the civil servant, I quote, "the freest expression of opinion, even against the government, and even any oppositional stance and action." However, civil servants were not the only ones who owed unconditional loyalty to the monarch and his government. Unlike other subjects and citizens, also the state was obliged to protect its civil servants and provide for their welfare. In the course of our study of the emperor's desk as a place of policy making, we have noticed exciting changes in how the emperor treated requests from his state officials, their widows and orphans. These changes are also related to the transformation of civil service law in Austria. The duties, activities, and welfare of civil servants underwent considerable juridification and legal concretization. In 1855, an official instruction stipulated that a civil servant should work with, I quote, "diligence and thoroughness, and must appear for service in the office as well as behave in an appropriate manner as a private person." Special attention was also paid to the uniforms, as you see here, which were regulated by law several times. With the constitutionalization of the monarchy, servants were now also ordered to abide by the constitution. In the 1860s, many servants struggled with the economic situation. So in 1873, a general salary regulation was issued to ensure that salaries were appropriate to the office. A total of 11 rank classes and 25 salary scales were introduced. The highest salaries were paid in Vienna, of course, followed by Brno, Graz, Krakow, Lviv, Lemberg, Prague, and Trieste. However, the civil service laws of 1873 also established career patterns, and at the same time, civil servants could now sue the state for compliance with the rights. And the bundle of rights of civil servants vis-à-vis the state was considerable. The state's duty to protect its civil servants was not exhausted with a salary. Surviving dependents also enjoyed claims to protection. And after 1866, the legal basis for these pension claims became fragmented. Different regulation existed in each case for Austrian-Hungary joint authorities, for state teaching staff, for policy officer, or gendarmerie officers. The rights of civil servants and their dependents included pay and pensions, but also conduct quotas to defray the cost of illness and funerals, as well as education contributions for widows with more than 3 children. The multitude of these rights and duties between the state and its servants was regulated then by the Dienstpragmatik in 1914. Civil servants now had different points of contact for their worries and needs. On the one hand, there was a well-organized interest group that successfully lobbied Parliament. On the other hand, there were the administrative courts which decided on the claims and demands arising from civil service law. And last but not least, and this is a subject of the following part presented by Peter, many civil servants petitioned. Petitions ended up on the emperor's desk.
Yes, and I would like to take you now into the abyss of evidence. We have cast a synoptic view on the emperor's desk by building a statistical database with about 30% of all the cases decided by Emperor Francis Joseph during the time of his long reign. Our sampling strategy was based on the registration of all decisions of every third year. As a result, with a bit more than 125,000 individual cases documented. To document each case, we used 22 variables, and 10 more variables were then calculated with our statistical package. Our database provides an opportunity to discuss the logic of the emperor's paperwork in more detail. And today, the focus will be obviously on his involvement in the management of the public service. Looking at our data, what we can easily recognize is that decisions on matters related to the public administrations were frequent during the time of neo-absolutism. And this is an evidence that you would see here in the first part, which is called periode, and state, Staat, would be the policy field in which here these decisions on the public service would be taken. Now, this finding that there was a very strong investment into a kind of state building in the time of neo-absolutism, this is certainly not worth the effort of building this database. More surprising is the observation, though, that there were other times in which there was a very heavy investment into the management of the state apparatus, and there is a certain incongruence between descriptive statistics and here the regression analysis, the results of which you can see here on the screen. With descriptive statistics, the time of liberalism, as we have called it here in the 1870s, has even more prominence in this respect. And this actually makes sense for two reasons, even though it's not fully supported here by the regression analysis. Why does it make sense? First, the public servants taken into the system during the 1850s were quite likely to ask for retirement in the 1870s. And this is not just a speculation, but if we look at the kind of, more specifically at the kind of issues that came up in this policy field, we can see that actually during this period of the 1870s, the number of retirement cases were the second highest throughout the reign of Francis Joseph. And the second reason why this makes sense is that during the late 60s and then also the 1870s, we can observe a strong pressure for the juridification of the public service. Jana already has mentioned the law of 1873. And the statistical evidence proves this point very well. The 1870s were the period with the highest number of laws enacted regarding the civil service during the reign of Emperor Francis Joseph. If you look here at this, at the evidence with 0.19 for the last two periods related to issue of state, what is very obvious is that, especially for the last period, the period of 1914 and 1915, it was not the war, but it was the introduction of the Dienstpragmatik, which Jana already has referred to, in which the rights and duties of the civil servants were codified, which caused this significant drop in the number of cases arriving at the emperor's desk related to the management of the public service. How did the emperor manage the public service? He used Vorträge, written presentations, which arrived at his desk from his ministries. The highest number of cases regarding the public service originated actually in the Ministry of Finance. About a quarter of all came from finance, followed by the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Justice, and the Council of Ministers. The share of the Ministry of Trade was close to 8%, with the Ministry of Education trailing behind closely. And the Hungarian ministries make a smaller contribution in the 3 to 4% range. The strong showing of the finance department can be related to the next observation, that question of personnel were quite dominant. Here, the finance ministry as the keeper of the purse was crucial and had, in addition, also a sizable staff of its own to be managed. If we look closer at the cases related to the management of personnel, we find a strong dominance of micromanagement and decisions on individual cases. And this is, I think this is true for the better part of all what we found here on the emperor's desk. In the case of the public service, 98.8% of all cases were related to individual cases. In that sense, micromanagement pure. The emperor took less time for deciding cases related to state administration than for all cases on average. This pattern was valid, however, until the late 1870s only. From the 1880s onwards, the pattern changed. Processing time increased since the 1890s across our sample, but it did so significantly stronger for public administration issues. As this was the time of strong nationalist tensions, which affected the system of public administration strongly, just consider the fallout from the Badeni crisis, this shift could not come as a surprise. This would be our reading of this evidence at the moment. There are 3 points to be made on the synoptic view on the public service. First, processing time did not correlate with the number of cases. High caseloads in the 1870s did not lead to an increase in time to take decisions. It rather resulted in technical innovations, such as collective processing of groups of cases. Second, the emperor was the best informed person regarding his public service. He processed almost 40,000 cases related to this policy field. They were almost entirely focused on the individual petitions. The emperor could delve into narratives of achievement, sacrifice, need, and loyalty. And this brings me to the second point, to the end of an era. We have discussed already the rather abrupt disappearance of files from the emperor's desk, which were related to the management of the public service in the Austrian part of the monarchy mainly. This was due to the redefinition of public service with the introduction of the Dienstpragmatik. Jan already mentioned it. This move was not wholeheartedly embraced by the emperor and by Archduke Francis Ferdinand. Both of them considered the fiction of a personal bond between public officials and the emperor as an important pillar of the Habsburg state. They resented the transformation of this bond into a contractual relationship. The Dienstpragmatik was the final point in the formalization and unification of the public service, which had reached in the early 1870s a first breaking point. This introduced an alternative possibility for civil servants to assert their claims. They could either turn to the Reichsgericht and legally enforce a claim, or they could turn to the emperor and ask for a Gnade, a grace. If they turned to the emperor, their petitions always included the emphasis on sacrifice made in the service of the emperor. Let me give you one example. When Oberforstrat Franz Wondrag from Linz petitioned the emperor for retirement and for a higher pension than the one that he could rightfully claim, he presented his career as an ongoing tribulation of duty with a significant higher amount of paperwork than his colleagues were assigned He never took a vacation. He never had a free weekend. He pictured himself as a dutiful person without any backlogs and as a servant which put the interest of the state above his own personal interest. This truly must have been the happy moments of Emperor Francis Joseph, when he could learn about the performance of a highly committed public servant through this petition. The Dienstpragmatik redirected the management of the public service away from his desk and deprived him of his pleasures. At the same time, he was saved from the confrontation with an abyss, in which some of the public servants were fallen through the guidance of the Dienstpragmatik. Let us consider the reflection of Friedrich von Kall, that you can see here on the screen. He was one of the judges at the Supreme Court in a session in May 1915. He wondered in his statement if the public official is only obligated to perform his service according to what he believes the Dienstpragmatik says, or is it a fiduciary relationship? Something the emperor would have had no trouble to answer. Gustav Kubitschek, a civil servant in the Bohemian tax office of Most, filed his claim at the Reichsgericht to have his travel expenses reimbursed. He incurred them by returning early from his vacation because of the beginning of the war. And one must say, the Austrian declaration of war was indeed badly timed. It was the scheduled beginning of the International Peace Conference in Vienna, but more importantly, it was also the time when many civil servants were on vacation and had to be called back to their offices. And the expenses for this they could claim according to the Dienstpragmatik. Gustav Kubitschek claimed them. He received a reimbursement, but reimbursement was later called back after an ad hoc revision of the Dienstpragmatik was just implemented because of exactly this avalanche of claims that arrived. When his case finally ended up at the Reichsgericht, von Kall raised the question about the very nature of the civil service, which I have already addressed. One could rephrase this question by referring to sacrifice, a term which was such a common reference in petitions to the emperor. How much sacrifice would be expected from an official in times of peace and especially in times of war? To Kubitschek, this was the wrong question, as sacrifice was not regulated in the Dienstpragmatik. Looking at the cases being processed at the Reichsgericht during the war, there's a strong impression that the beginning of the war coincided with the end of an era regarding the culture of public administration. John Deak has emphasized the impact of the war and the military on public administration. We argue that the change in administrative culture was more complex. It can be related to two somewhat connected trajectories. The first one was the impact of war, and the second was related to the Dienstpragmatik and the redefinition of the public service from an organization being based on loyalty and allegiance towards the emperor to a contractual relationship between the public servants and the state as their employer. Now, here. Let me come briefly to the last point, the emperor's afterlife. The emperor's desk's afterlife, actually. During the reign of Francis Joseph, the state and his desk were intimately connected. This connection was severed stepwise towards the end of his reign and after his death. As a coda to our argument, in which we trace the slow reduction of influence of the emperor's desk on the public service, we would like to point your attention to some instances where the emperor's desk even lived on after the emperor's death, and even after the dissolution of the monarchy. Let us, for this purpose, consider the submission of Ottilie Wondrak. She's actually the daughter of Oberforstrat Franz Wondrak, which I've already introduced, to the provincial government in Linz from 1919. She identified herself as the author of Franz Wondrak, who died early, as did his wife. They left behind a daughter whose rapidly deteriorating eyesight reduced her chances to find a position as a seamstress on the labor market. she turned to the emperor for help, and with the support of the Ministry of Agriculture, she was granted a Gnadengabe in 1913, a subsidy in the amount of 400 crowns per year. The war did not improve her health, nor did it improve her financial situation. The post-war inflation neither. She continued to ask for support, turning not to the emperor, but rather to the representatives of the new state. She started her petition, however, with a reference to the Allerhöchste Entschließung. That means the decision of the emperor from June 30, 1913. The emperor's decision was the anchor point in her petition to the new government, in which she tacitly assumed the continuity of responsibility and funding rationale between the monarchy and the republic. She asked for a renewal of her subsidy, which was about to terminate, using basically the same letter she sent 3 years earlier to the Statthalter, in which she came in for a first renewal in 1916. She continued asking for renewals during the 1920s and 1930s, and the Upper Austrian government kept approving her requests and argued in their decision with the emperor's resolution. This case is interesting as it highlights the ambivalence of the intimate connection between the emperor's desk and the Austrian state. The micromanagement of the state apparatus oscillated between rights and mercy. The petitions to the emperor were assessed and selectively forwarded to his ministry for further evaluation. In the case of Ottilie Wondrak, the Ministry of Agriculture had supported her petition. The emperor then approved of the subsidy. This remained fully within the register of grace and mercy, for which monarchs claimed a specific competence. Considering the high volume of requests and the need to avoid arbitrary decisions, the emperor's mercy was, however, underpinned by bureaucratic procedures and of assessment and evaluation. Even the emperor's grace was classified in 3 different categories, which materialized in 3 forms of signatures under the petition. Ottilie Wondrak was granted her subsidy on the basis of similar procedures as later welfare recipients would have to submit in welfare offices. The emperor's grace was based on rules of procedure. The logic of precedence guaranteed a high level of predictability and uniform increase in pension payments. This made the emperor's grace compatible with the bureaucratic procedures of the First Republic. The Wondrak case illustrates perfectly well this double continuity from monarchy to republic and from grace to bureaucratic decision-making.
Just
I
let you
suggest
know.
we just leave it with that and to have 2 minutes more for discussion.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Okay. Thank you very much.
No, thank you guys.
Thank you too.